The year is 2001. Imagine that your country has just fallen victim to one of the worst terror attacks that has ever taken place. This event caused the deaths of thousands of your citizens, and it was perpetrated by a rogue group of terrorists who meticulously planned the hijacking of 4 commercial airplanes and decided to crash them into the most iconic buildings of your most iconic city. The perpetrators also crashed into the headquarters of your nation's military. The whole nation is in mourning, while investigators rush to figure out how they could prevent something like this from ever happening again. The leaders of your country meet with their top advisors and help draft some legislation that would enable the government to stop things like this happening in the future. Several ideas are touted, some of the primary ones being the creation of new bureaus to help increase the domestic security of your country. This also includes new bureaus dedicated to increasing the safety of air travel. This was arguably a necessary change, seeing as before this terror event, travel restrictions were quite lax, and this is what allowed the hijackers of the plane to enter with guns and ultimately take control of the planes. However, there was a new law that was passed by your country's legislators after this event, which would set the stage for a new era of mass government surveillance. And that is what I will be questioning the ethics of in this video. This bill would come to be known as the Patriot Act, and it was a landmark bill that enabled your country's government to do a lot more investigation and surveillance with little oversight or without those pesky little warrants. The bill had many provisions, however, we will be focusing on the ones that enabled mass surveillance. The leaders of your country reassured the populace that the purpose of this bill was not to infringe on your civil liberties, but to protect you from potential criminals or terrorists who clearly posed a threat to you, considering what had just happened recently. The surveillance would take many forms, but the primary way in which this surveillance would be used is to weed out people who are suspected of committing a crime or people who are involved in terroristic activities. The data scientists who are employed by these surveillance bureaus then begin to comb through all their personal details, whether it be messages or phone calls, search engine history, essentially anything and everything that was in their digital footprint. They would come through it with the intention of finding incriminating information. All of this would be done with virtually no oversight, as stated previously. However, after a decade or so of your country building up their surveillance bureaus, the surveillance becomes less focused on individuals who are suspicious and becomes more all-encompassing due to the popularization of social media. This increased nationwide dependence on the internet leads to teams of data scientists combing through petabytes of personal data, which is flagged if the government deems it to be sufficiently terroristic. So, in other words, everyone in the country who is using the internet is being passively surveilled constantly. The ethics of this kind of surveillance can be argued in many ways to be as consistent as possible. I will be choosing an ethical standard to base my analysis on. The ethical standard I will be using is called the Oxford Munich Code of Ethics. This code of ethics was created by Oxford University data scientists because they began to realize how prevalent the extraction of data was worldwide, in both public and private sector. Your government spy on you, as well as the companies who develop the software that you have on your phone or computer. They are all collecting your data for various purposes. In the case of the private sector, it is to make money from it, because any piece of software that is free nowadays is only free because they are selling your data. And in the public sector, it is typically used for government surveillance and for cybersecurity purposes. The specific provisions of the Oxford Munich Code of Ethics that I will be using are provisions 5A, 1A, and 1B. Provision 5A states that when you are in the realm of data science, it is your duty to be transparent. The actual quote is, quote, "The data scientists will strive for transparency as wide a form as possible," end quote. And the reason I picked this provision in particular is because I believe that there are a lot of issues regarding transparency when it comes to government orchestrated surveillance. The next provision I chose was 1A. This provision states that data scientists must act in accordance with the law. The full quote is, "The data scientists will always act in accordance with the law, developing a full knowledge of and ensuring compliance with all relevant regulatory regimes. Employers should take steps to raise their data scientists' awareness and knowledge of such issues." The reason I picked Provision 1A is because the surveillance in question is enabled by the laws this country passed. The final provision I picked is Provision 1B, and this provision states that data scientists must protect privacy and confidentiality. The full quote reads, "The data scientist has a duty to act so as to protect the privacy and confidentiality of data, respecting the ownership of proprietary data, and in not exposing data within private or public forums that might cause any harm to individuals or legal entities." The reason I picked Provision 1B is because government surveillance tends to have issues with protecting privacy and confidentiality. Now, with our provisions, we can determine whether the government surveillance is ethical or not. I will be starting with Provision 5A, which states that data scientists should strive for as much transparency as possible. I believe that under this provision, the mass government surveillance is unethical. This is because the government would not be able to be transparent about their surveillance because it would render it futile. Seen as potential terrorists would be more cautious when using unencrypted messaging apps, as well as other things. Not to mention that they would not be able to conduct investigations of suspects reliably. Next, I will be using Provision 1A, which states that data scientists must act in accordance with the law. I believe that under this provision, the mass government surveillance is ethical because the government wrote the law and they are complying with it. The law they passed allows them to extrajudicially spy on suspects. Now, lastly, I will be using Provision 1B. This provision states that data scientists have a duty to protect the privacy and confidentiality of data. Given that the government's goal with its surveillance is to find potential terrorists and prevent their terrorism, and each piece of data that is being analyzed has a name attached to it, it cannot uphold privacy and confidentiality during its surveillance, seen as the act of collecting this data is its very self a breach of privacy. Therefore, under Provision 1B, the government surveillance is unethical. Overall, I find that government-sponsored surveillance is unethical. Whilst I do agree that finding and disarming terrorists is a noble cause, that the precedent that it sets and the loss of a basic right to privacy is a tough pill to swallow and a door that I think should stay closed.